Hi, it's Pastor Maggie from Celebration Lutheran Church. Today we're going to talk about communion. Now, communion is one of two sacraments, and different flavors of Christianity think about sacraments differently. So the Lutherans have two sacraments, and what makes a sacrament is it's kind of a math problem. It's something commanded by Jesus in Scripture, plus a physical element of our normal lives that we can touch, and then that equals God's grace. So sacraments are the gifts of God's grace. It's a place that God promises to show up. God shows up and is at work in our lives, in our world, all over the place, but oftentimes we can't, we see it in hindsight, or we realize it later, or we just miss it altogether, right? We're never always 100% aware of God's work around us, but the sacraments are those places we know we can go and we're going to encounter God. And it's a little bit scandalous that those places are baptism, like regular water from the tap, plus communion, this meal we share, this little piece of bread and sip of wine that we get when we gather. But that's the scandal of God, is God will not be confined to our boxes, and God's like, yep, I'm going to show up in this little ordinary meal that you're sharing. And so we gather, every time we gather around this meal. It is the central part of our worship, actually. More important even than the sermon is gathering for this meal. And we share the meal every time we gather, because, again, it's where God is promising to meet us. And baptism sort of begins this life of faith, and the communion is what sustains us through. So we have communion every time we gather. I know that's not every church's practice, and historically, churches kind of fell out of that practice, mostly for resources, because there weren't really enough pastors to come and preside at the meal. And why pastors preside at the meal, or someone who is ordained, is really for the sake of good order, because this meal is a holy meal. This meal is a big deal, and so we do put some structure around how we have it. So some of that is created by people, right, as we organized the church. But the meal itself was commanded by Jesus, and it was part of Jesus' last night there with his friends, right? He gathered them around at the Last Supper and took the bread and then took the cup. And the communion meal, as we celebrate it in worship, is rooted in Scripture there. We say the words that are repeated, that come from Scripture, because we make the meal as close to that meal as we can, right? In the elements that Jesus used, the bread and the wine, right? Obviously the amounts are different. Jesus didn't give everyone a tiny little piece. But we remember the meal. We remember that night, and we receive Jesus in ourselves, right? And Christians actually throughout history kind of got made fun of for this practice. We got called cannibals, or like those people who eat flesh and drink blood. Like, that's kind of weird and creepy, right? Because this meal has always been a defining part of what makes Christians Christians. And Lutherans understand communion. The presence of Jesus in communion is that Jesus is present there in, with, and under the bread and the wine. In, with, and under. This is what we proclaim. It doesn't make tons of sense, right? So basically it's a mystery. Jesus is there. Jesus is here at this meal. It's Jesus' meal, right? And Jesus is present in the bread and the wine, or the juice of the fruit of the vine. So that's what grape juice is. Jesus is present there too. And we don't really know how, right? So ultimately it's a mystery, and we come in faith that we are meeting Jesus, that God is a God who keeps God's promises, and that this is how Jesus commanded us to do. It's what the early church in Acts did. Every time they gathered around the table, and it's where we receive the grace of God, the forgiveness of God. The words that Jesus says there, this is the new covenant in my blood, shed for you and for all people for the forgiveness of sin. There's forgiveness happening here too. So we're receiving God's grace. We are reminded that we are forgiven, and we are receiving Christ, who then sustains us through the week till the next time we gather. So communion is what makes us Christians, and as Lutherans being a sacramental denomination, a flavor of Christianity that acknowledges these sacraments, that creates and forms our worship life around them. Doing that shows how important it is. And even if we can't explain everything exactly how it is, it's a mystery ultimately, but it's God's work, that God is doing the forgiving. God has laid down the body and blood of Christ for us, and we receive that when we come to the table. And we come trusting that when we do, we're meeting Jesus there. Yeah. What else do we want to say about communion? I think that's good. Yeah, I hope you can find a stopping point.